Hi, and welcome to the last lecture of English Linguistics 317 for this semester. We are going to wrap up with World Englishes and a note on, well, what is going to come for English. We talked about, trying to see why this screen is coming like that. Okay, so we'll move this here. All right, so we talked about the fact that English has become a global language, and we looked at two varieties of English, the African American Vernacular English and the Irish English. And today what we are going to do is we are going to look at two Asian Englishes, well, one that is close to my heart, Indian English, and the other, Singaporean English. So let's start with Indian English. India belongs to the outer circle in the three-circle model, right? The inner circle, the outer circle, and the expanding circle. And the reason being that English is an official language and also a second language in India. It's used for government purposes. It's used as an official language for different official purposes. And although US is the leading country for English speakers, India is actually the second leading country for English speakers. So in US, there are approximately 250 million people, and in India, there's approximately 125 million people, second largest, but makes up for only 10% of the total population because we're the second largest population in the world. The reason being that in India, we have about 1,600 languages, and therefore to communicate with one another, to communicate with different communities, you need to have a lingua franca, and that lingua franca is English. We don't have a national language. There are two official languages, Hindi and English, and so English is really very often the language that unites people together. The British people came into India around 16th century, at the same time that they discovered America. Well, Columbus actually thought that he was discovering India when he came to America. And one of the good things that the British left India was all the school system that they had, wonderful schools that they had in England. And so Indian English was influenced not just by British English, but also by local languages that existed in India. So here are some pronunciation things. There are a lot of retroflexes in Indian languages. So these are things like la and ra and wa, etc. These are retroflexes that are pronounced with like rolling back your tongue. And so these, you may hear a lot of Indian people use these retroflexes in certain pronunciations of English, and they sound really foreign to a non-native speaker or to a native speaker of English. But it's perfectly like an interference effect from the local language that they speak to the English that they speak. There's no distinction between W and we, as you know from your instructor. I don't have a distinction between W and we. Aspiration is phonemic, so we do have a distinction between like the p, t, k at the onset position and the aspirated versions p, t, k. That we don't have diphthongs as in fate and boat, right? So very often you would hear Indian people saying fate and boat with like the short vowels. And many Indian languages are syllable timed rather than stress timed, and therefore what happens is very often you will hear native speakers say that Indian people speak in a very sing-song fashion, and I think a lot of pop culture accents of Indian people follow this kind of syllable timed syncopated kind of effect, which is not really how a lot of Indian people speak. I don't speak that way, but I think it's a stereotype, right? Especially in like the pop culture. With grammar, we have a question formation with a no inversion. So why you are saying that instead of why are you saying that? Question formation, we use a lot of tags. We are meeting tomorrow, isn't it? Right? It's kind of like you're asking for confirmation from the other person. Using progressive forms for stative verbs, like he is knowing English well rather than he knows English well. Obviously, we talked about vocabulary before. There's a lot of words that Indian English has that has been borrowed into American English and British English. All right, so let's get into Singapore English. Singapore has 4 official languages: English, Mandarin Chinese, Tamil, and Malay, right? Now, in about 2000, the government of Singapore wanted to promote only British English, and they started to create a Speak Good English campaign. But there was a local variety, which is called a Singlish, Singaporean English, right, that flourished. So here are some characteristics of Singlish. They treat mass nouns as count nouns. So you can count them, luggages, furnitures, etc. So they actually make them into count nouns instead of mass nouns. In English, they're mass nouns. They use the verb used to indicate habitual activity. So I used to go shopping on Mondays, meaning I usually go shopping on Mondays. The form would is often used for will. So we hope you would come tomorrow rather than we hope you will come tomorrow. They also use tag questions, just like Indian English. He's going to buy a car, isn't it? They're also replaced by can or not. So she wants to go, can or not, right? An indefinite article is not always used. He is teacher, right? I forgot to mention before we started Singaporean English, do you all know where Singapore is? I mean, again, when I teach it face-to-face, it's easy for me to answer questions like that because obviously somebody will ask a question and I'll answer it. But with the asynchronous mode, it's always like, I feel like I in my head, I'm assuming that you know this, but maybe it's not so obvious. So, well, Google it if you don't know where Singapore is. Other characteristics of Singlish with contact with other languages such as Malay and Hokkien and Cantonese, they have something called a la particle that comes at the end. So it's sunny la, how are you la, right? They often use this. If you've watched like the new movie, oh my God, I can't remember the movie's name right now, but the Crazy Rich Asians, yes, they use this a lot in that, the la particle. Often drops the copula to be. So instead of saying you are terrific, they have things like you terrific. They also have a lot of vocabulary borrowed from other local languages, and they also have their own slang, and believe it or not, it's called talking cock. And they also have calc formations that they are things like catch no ball from the Hokkien, and chak kantang, which means to affect a Western accent. Literally, it means put potatoes in your mouth and talk. So I have a website here if you want to know more about Singlish and its slang. And they also have their own dictionary, the Oxford Singlish Dictionary. And basically, because of the Speak Good English campaign in 2002, the people started a Save Our Singlish campaign because they really took pride in the way that they spoke. Okay, so now I want to speculate a little bit about the future of English. Where do you think we're going? Right? This makes for a wonderful discussion in a face-to-face classroom. So I'm really sorry that we have to do this asynchronously, but you know, you will be doing an assignment on this, for example. In expanding circles, American English and British English compete as a main target variety, right? So when we talk about English as a sign language, British English was the predominant language for ESL, not in America, but in other parts of the world. Now, there are many colonized countries that went away from England, like Kenya, for example. So, for example, in Kenya in 1963, English was an official language, but the government replaced it with Swahili in 1974. Now, people or African writers who write in English also have sort of mixed feelings about whether English should continue as an official language, should continue as one of the main languages of these colonized countries, because really the idea is that to come out of that colonization aspect in the post-colonial era, you have to take pride in your local languages, in your local identity, and that kind of thing. So here's a paragraph from Chinua Achebe from 1964. And again, I will let you pause the video at your own convenience and read the passage. So the last module, we talked about a couple of TED Talks that I wanted you to listen to. So basically, does the use of English as a global language undermine reduction of local languages? That is English causing the death of other languages, right? So given that we have about 7,000 languages in the world, estimates predict that about 50 to 80% of them will become extinct in the next 100 years or so. What do you think? Is this a result of the spread of English, or is it other local languages, or what do you think? Again, this is something that I would open up for a debate in class, but right now I just want you to speculate on your own while you're watching this video. Well, there are obviously benefits of a global language because there are opportunities for speakers, there are more employment for speakers, there's communication, there's medical advances, there's technological advances, etc. But there's also something that the linguist David Crystal talks about, the arrival of a world standard spoken English. That is, we don't have a standard for writing. I mean, writing can change from country to country, from region to region, but I think there's something called the world standard spoken English, because that's really what global English is all about, speaking and communicating with each other. What next? I mean, do you think that modern English era is already over? I think it is, for sure. We are kind of living in the next kind of change of English. We don't know what that is. We don't know what the name is. Maybe postmodern English, new millennium English, right? Right now, the internet is dividing the change between modern English and what comes next, right? And maybe we will know 100 years from now what this era is going to be called, right? With the advent of the internet, one of the things that has happened is the destabilizing the notion of the text or notion of authorship. And this is something many of you who came to Dr. Connor's colloquium talk listen to, for example, or if you take Dr. Lanning's class, you get a hint of what this is talking about. Internet is also creating a new kind of literacy, and it's widening the speed of written communication beyond the printed text, right? So the standards of writing English are changing as we speak. Well, when we talk about internet, we can also talk about email and internet messaging and chatting and texting. And each of these, they have a different rule set that they follow, right? I mean, you cannot say that the kind of communication that we use in email is the same as what we use to chat or write a text message, for example. Now, how are these forms of communications having an effect on our lexicon? So now we can say things like we can shop online as we point and click on the websites of innumerable .coms and spend hours surfing the web. Well, ask like a person from like 17th century or 18th century to read this, and he or she is going to be like, what? Right? So nowadays, when we talk about a lot of terminology, we are talking about a lot of internet terminology, a lot of terminology that did not exist, right? Say in the Industrial Revolution kind of era. If you can look at the word of the year vote from the American Dialect Society, you can see that in the year 2000, all the way up to 2010, a lot of electronically kind of used words in the internet era received the word of the year vote. So Y2K, fish, tweet, to Google, which actually was the word of the decade, right, etc. Very often, you might hear people saying that in the younger generation, for instance, emailing and texting are undermining standards of written English. So here's an example, right, of a text. Very often, these are, things that you would see, right, like short forms and emojis, right, etc. What do you think? Do you think they're undermining standards of written English, right? So there are non-standard spellings now that are on the rise, lack of capitalization, the use of abbreviation, etc. But what can you say? I mean, do we really have a standard to uphold to? Do you really think that standards are declining? Do you really see these changes happening in real time when you go into like USC 259 and see your children do it? Are there differences between what you do and what they do, etc.? Things for you to think about. Now, the advantages of electronic communication is that, well, basically you can switch between standards, right? So you can go from a very formal style to a very informal style really quickly, right? And so people really talk about netiquette, or basically standard conventions of how you should email or how you should text somebody, right? Or communicating properly over the internet in various electronic contexts. And they've also encouraged users to abandon conventions like capitalization. Capitalization for me is something that I've never really understood. I'm like, why do we capitalize? I don't really see the logic behind it. So very often I don't capitalize. I mean, obviously for formal writing, I do, like if I'm writing a paper or I'm writing an email and that kind of thing. But if I write poetry, for example, I don't capitalize anything. I always question that. Or if I do capitalize it, I'm doing it for a reason, that kind of thing. Conventions such as formal greetings are changing, paragraph structures are changing, spellings are changing, and use of punctuation is changing in the electronic era. These are, I mean, a lot of things in here are new to me. I don't normally use a lot of acronyms when I text. I'm a little old school that way, but I'm pretty sure that a lot of these are very familiar to most of you, or you would have either you use it or you would see other people use it, like maybe your younger siblings, for example. So this is again attributed to the electronic mediums of communication. And of course, emojis, which were called as emoticons, right, created first in 1982 by a computer science professor, right, and he created it to disambiguate jokes and non-jokes on a university bulletin. They serve discourse functions and they help create a context. I mean, I can teach a whole class on emojis, really, so I don't have much to say about it in this module and this class, but I really think that people are using a lot more emojis, and there's a lot more syntactic complexity to emojis than we initially think there is. The fact that writing is changing and speaking is changing also changes our understanding of literacy. Now, on a web page, for example, like Wikipedia, you can change the content every single day. So it questions authorship, right? Who's the author? Is this news credible, right? Can I believe it? Is it fake news? Is it misinformation, right? But at the same time, internet also facilitates the growth of English because majority of internet is in English, right? I mean, very often you have to translate it into other languages if you want to use it in Spanish or French or German. Majority of the content is in English, for example. So this is the ending notes that I want you to take home. You know enough about English, you know about different dialects, you know not to discriminate between different dialects of English, you know the history behind how we came from Old English sounding really Scandinavian and Viking to sounding more English today. But I want you to think about this, that language changes every single day. It's going to change in the next 20, 30 years. It's going to change in the next 70 years or so. But what does it mean for the future of English? And what does it mean, I think, beyond all of this, for the future of English education, right? How are you going to become the best possible English educator in Wichita, right? Or in Andover or Haysville? That's what I want you to think about. Like, what can you take from 317 that's really going to help you become the best teacher, right? So that's really what I want you to take home from this. And I wish you all the best and good luck with everything.